In 2022, the US State Department's annual report on Chinese military power described China as having no treaty allies and facing strategic isolation in its security relationships. That same year, China's Ministry of National Defense published the updated text of defense cooperation agreements with 23 sovereign states, covering joint exercises, logistics access, intelligence sharing protocols, and arms transfer frameworks. Both documents are public. Almost no one has read both of them in the same sitting. The no allies claim is technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. China has no equivalent of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the mutual defense clause that makes an attack on one member an attack on all. What it does have, documented in agreements accessible through the Chinese Ministry of National Defense and cross-referenced in the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's arms transfer database, is a web of bilateral security arrangements that produce most of what an alliance produces, without using the word. Start with the geography. China's defense cooperation agreements, distinct from its broader Belt and Road Memoranda, now cover partners in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. The CIPRI Arms Transfers database, updated through 2023, shows China as the primary arms supplier to 31 countries over the preceding decade. Of those 31, 18 have also signed defense cooperation agreements with Beijing. That overlap is not coincidental. Arms dependency and security cooperation tend to move together. The supplier relationship creates the leverage that makes the cooperation agreement possible. The specific agreements matter more than the aggregate count. The 2021 China-Pakistan Defense Cooperation Agreement, renewed and expanded, includes provisions for joint operational planning, not just joint exercises, but coordinated planning. The 2019 agreement with Cambodia granted Chinese naval vessels priority berthing access at Ream Naval Base, a provision Cambodian officials denied until satellite imagery published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2022 showed construction of Chinese-funded facilities at the site. Denial followed by concrete. That sequence has appeared before. What the no allies framing consistently obscures is that basing access, arms dependency, and joint operational planning are the functional architecture of an alliance. The mutual defense clause is the public commitment. The rest is the actual capability. And the capability is what moves ships, positions aircraft, and determines where a country's forces can be in 72 hours. The United States built its Cold War security architecture the same way. Bilateral agreements, status of forces arrangements, base access deals, before the formal treaties followed. The sequence runs operational access first, formal commitment later, or never, depending on whether the formal commitment is politically necessary. China is in the first phase. Calling that phase isolation is a choice, and the choice tells you more about the analyst than the data. 31 primary arms recipients, 23 defense cooperation agreements, 18 countries in both categories. Those numbers come from CIPRI and from China's own published treaty record. The State Department's report cited neither. The architecture did not assemble itself. Between 2015 and 2023, China's People's Liberation Army conducted joint military exercises with 42 countries, a figure published in the PLA's own white papers and independently verified by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in its 2023 Military Balance Report. In 2015, that number was 17. The rate of expansion is not the story most defence analysts highlight. The destination of that expansion is. Look at where the exercises went. Prior to 2017, the overwhelming majority of China's joint military activity was concentrated in Central Asia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization framework and in Pakistan. After 2017, the pattern shifts. Exercises appear in the Gulf, in East Africa, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and, most consequentially, in the South Atlantic. China conducted its first joint naval exercise with Argentina and South Africa in 2023. The South Atlantic has been an American strategic rear for 80 years. There are no US bases there. There are no treaty obligations that would automatically respond to a Chinese naval presence. The exercise happened, was reported briefly, and disappeared from the Western policy conversation within a week. The mechanism behind this expansion has two components, and they operate simultaneously. The first is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which China has used since 2000 to bundle infrastructure financing, arms transfers, and defence cooperation into single bilateral packages. When a country receives a FOCAC infrastructure loan, the agreement typically includes a defence cooperation annex. That annex is rarely the headline. It is always in the document. By 2023, 41 of the 54 African Union member states had signed FOCAC frameworks with active defence cooperation components, according to the African Union Commission's own treaty registry. The second component is the training pipeline. China's National Defence University in Beijing has graduated military officers from 68 countries since 2000, a figure the university itself publishes in its annual report. Officer training is not a neutral act. It builds doctrine alignment, personal relationships between officer corps, and over time, procurement preferences. The United States has understood this since the Cold War, which is why the International Military Education and Training Program, IMET, has been a central tool of American alliance management for decades. China is running the same program. It is running it faster. And in several African and Central Asian states, it has now trained more senior officers than the US IMET program has in the same period, according to figures compiled by the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies in 2022. What this tells me, and I'll stake something on it, is that the no allies framing is not an analytical error. It is a classification decision. By defining alliance exclusively as a mutual defence treaty, Western policy discourse has created a category that excludes almost everything China is actually building. The exclusion is convenient. It allows the conclusion, China is isolated, to survive contact with a treaty record that says otherwise. The arms transfer data makes the mechanism visible in dollar terms. Between 2018 and 2022, China's defence exports totaled approximately $5.5 billion annually, according to CIPRI. That figure is lower than the American equivalent by a factor of roughly 7. But the American figure is concentrated in wealthy treaty allies, South Korea, Japan, the Gulf states, who were already inside the alliance architecture. China's $5.5 billion is concentrated in countries that had no prior major power security patron. That is a different kind of leverage. It is not replacing an alliance. It is creating a dependency where none existed before. The Cambodia case is worth returning to. When the CSIS satellite analysis confirmed Chinese-funded construction at Ream Naval Base in 2022, the Cambodian government continued to deny exclusive Chinese access. The denial is probably accurate in the technical sense. The base is not a Chinese military base. What it is a facility built with Chinese financing, staffed with equipment procured through Chinese defence agreements, and accessible to Chinese naval vessels under the priority berthing clause of the 2019 cooperation agreement. The distinction between exclusive access and priority access matters operationally for exactly no one who needs to move a fleet through the Gulf of Thailand on short notice. The forum, the training pipeline, the arms dependency, the base access agreements, these are not separate initiatives. They are the same initiative executed through different instruments, producing the same operational result. The strongest counterargument is not that China has no security relationships. Even the analysts most committed to the isolation framing have largely conceded that ground. The real counterargument, the one that deserves engagement, is that China's agreements are structurally shallow, that they lack the enforcement mechanisms and institutional depth that make NATO or the US-Japan Mutual Defence Treaty function as genuine security guarantees, and that when pressure arrives, these partners will not hold. That argument has genuine weight. Take it seriously for a moment. The 2020 border clash between China and India in the Galwan Valley killed 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese troops. The PLA has never released a confirmed figure, though US intelligence estimates cited by Reuters in 2021 placed Chinese casualties between 35 and 45. During that clash, Russia, which holds a comprehensive strategic partnership with China, signed in 2001 and reaffirmed in February 2022, sold S-400 air defense systems to India. Active delivery. while Chinese soldiers were dying on the Indian border. If your closest quasi-ally sells advanced weapons to the country you are fighting, the depth of the partnership requires reassessment. Add the economic coercion cases. When China applied trade pressure on Australia between 2020 and 2022, tariffs on barley, wine, coal, beef, and lobster, totaling restrictions on approximately $9 billion in annual exports, according to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Not one of China's 23 defence cooperation partners issued a statement of support. Not one adjusted its own trade posture in solidarity. Contrast that with the NATO response to Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, where 31 member states coordinated sanctions within 72 hours. The institutional reflex simply does not exist in China's network. These are real limitations. The counter-argument earns its place. And then you run the specific numbers, and the counter-argument begins to show its load-bearing assumption, that alliance value is measured primarily by crisis solidarity rather than by pre-crisis positioning. Return to the figure from Part 1, 18 countries that appear in both the CIPRI arms transfer data and China's Defence Cooperation Agreement registry. Those 18 countries collectively control access to 6 strategic choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Gulf of Aden, the Mozambique Channel, the Lombok Strait, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the approaches to the Eastern Mediterranean through the Suez Corridor. This is not an assertion. The choke point geography is documented in US Naval Institute publications, and the overlap with China's partner states can be mapped directly from the CIPRI and AU treaty databases. An alliance that produces choke point access without a mutual defense clause is not a weak alliance. It is a different kind of alliance, one optimized for economic leverage and force projection corridors rather than territorial defense. NATO was built to hold a line in Central Europe. China's network is not trying to hold a line. It is trying to control the arteries. Those are different strategic objectives, and measuring one by the metrics of the other produces exactly the analytical error that isolation framing commits. My read on this is that the solidarity test, will they show up when it matters, is the wrong test for what China is building. The right test is when the US 7th Fleet needs to move through the Gulf of Aden, or when American logistics chains depend on port access in East Africa, how many of those 23 defense cooperation partners have already signed agreements that give China prior consultation rights on foreign military access? The answer, documented in the agreement texts published by the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, is 11. 11 countries where China has negotiated prior consultation clauses on third-party military access. That is not a solidarity mechanism. That is a veto architecture. The Russia-India arms sale happened. The Australian solidarity gap is real. China's network will not produce 31 countries sanctioning anyone in 72 hours. Every one of those concessions stands. What they do not change is the choke point map or the 11 prior consultation clauses, or the fact that the PLA conducted exercises in the South Atlantic in 2023 and the policy conversation moved on before the ships returned to port. Here is where the accounting lands. 23 defence cooperation agreements, 31 primary arms recipients, 42 joint exercise partners, 11 prior consultation clauses on third-party military access, 6 strategic choke points controlled by states inside China's cooperation network. These are not projections or estimates derived from modelling. They are published figures, cross-referenced across the CIPRI Arms Transfers database, the Chinese Ministry of National Defense Treaty Registry, the IISS Military Balance 2023, and the African Union Commission's treaty records. The no allies conclusion requires ignoring all of them simultaneously. The Western policy consensus built that conclusion on a definition: alliance as mutual defence treaty, narrow enough to exclude the entire operational reality it was supposed to describe. That is not an analytical failure in the conventional sense. Analysts make errors. This is something more specific, a classification system that was never designed to capture what China is building, applied anyway, and then cited as evidence that nothing is being built. What China is building is legible if you read the right documents. It is an access network, basing rights without bases, arms dependency without formal obligation, officer training without doctrine announcements, prior consultation clauses dressed as diplomatic courtesy. Every component has a precedent in American alliance history. The US built its own periphery with status of forces agreements, military assistance programs, and base access arrangements decades before some of those relationships acquired formal treaty status. The Philippines, South Korea, Diego Garcia. The architecture preceded the commitment in every case. China is running the same sequencing. The people who should be saying so loudest are, for reasons worth examining, the quietest. The counter-argument from Part 3, that these relationships lack depth, that they won't hold under pressure, remains partially true and almost entirely beside the point. An alliance that controls 11 prior consultation clauses over third-party military access does not need to hold under pressure. It applies pressure before the crisis arrives. That is a more efficient design. It does not require solidarity. It requires positioning. And the positioning is already done. What I find harder to dismiss than any single agreement or exercise figure is the cumulative timeline. Between 2015 and 2023, China expanded its joint exercise partners from 17 to 42 countries. It signed defence cooperation agreements with 23 states. It graduated military officers from 68 countries through the National Defence University. It secured priority berthing at Ream Naval Base, began construction of naval facilities in Djibouti, its only acknowledged overseas military installation, operational since 2017, and conducted its first South Atlantic exercises. All of this happened inside 8 years. The speed is the signal. This is not a country consolidating an existing position. It is a country building an architecture that does not yet have a name, fast enough that the naming keeps getting deferred. The prediction, stated specifically enough to be tested, by 2028, China will have secured documented logistics access, port agreements, priority berthing, or fuel and maintenance arrangements in at least 3 additional countries that currently have no formal defence relationship with Beijing. The candidates based on existing Belt and Road infrastructure investment and current FOCAC negotiation tracks are Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Solomon Islands, where a security agreement signed in 2022 already includes provisions that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute flagged as consistent with future basing rights. If those 3 materialise, the chokepoint map changes in ways that affect American naval planning in the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the East African littoral simultaneously. That is a testable claim. Mark the date. The no allies framing will probably survive this video. It will survive because it is load-bearing for a set of policy conclusions that would become harder to defend if the framing changed. Conclusions about Chinese strategic overreach, about the durability of American primacy, about whether the current pace of US alliance investment in the Indo-Pacific is proportionate to the actual competitive position. Changing the framing means revisiting the conclusions. That is expensive. So the framing stays, and the treaty record sits in the appendices where it has always been. Read the appendices. If this kind of primary source breakdown is what you come here for, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. The algorithm does not reliably surface this material to people who haven't told it to.